Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is visiting Israel this week, and the headline that I saw in Middle East Eye, a little bit misleading, says that Florida Governor blames Palestinians for Israeli occupation, which is a bit disingenuous of a way to frame it. His comments, while incorrect in my opinion, were not quite so bombastic or offensive as Middle East Eye framed it. What he actually said was that the problem with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that, well, these Palestinians just won't recognize Israel's right to exist, which is, of course, a load of hooey. What DeSantis means when he says that the Palestinians won't recognize Israel's right to exist is that there are certain people in the West Bank and Gaza who recognize that a lot of Arabs were deprived of their property outside of the West Bank and Gaza in what is now Israel, and they would like to go back and reclaim their land. But of course, if the Arabs, the Palestinian refugees around the world who had to flee after they were kicked out of their homes by Jewish right-wing death squads, if they returned to what is now Israel, the Arabs would probably have somewhat of a majority over the Jewish population there. And therefore, if Jews are not a majority in Israel, well, then it's not going to be a Jewish state, and hence that means that they want to destroy Israel. And DeSantis actually did go into a bit more detail about that, because he did specifically say they don't recognize Israel's right as a Jewish state, which I guess in a certain sense is somewhat true, though a dishonest way of framing it. You know, frankly, I don't see why Middle East Eye even had to poorly frame DeSantis' comments, because his comments themselves are poorly framed. I think that what he said in reality is even worse than what the headline says. And not to mention that the people he's talking about who do want to go, who believe in, the right to return and want to go back, and that is absolutely a red line issue for them, and they will not compromise with Israel on that matter, those folks are not everybody in the Palestinian territories, because believe it or not, a lot of people who live in the West Bank and Gaza are people who were just born there. They've lived there their whole lives, and they see soldiers walking around in the streets, and and it's really hard, and they have to go through a bunch of checkpoints to go about their daily lives. And most of them probably don't really care that much, wouldn't care that much about Israel giving other people's land back if they would just leave them alone. And then, of course, there's a spectrum in between. So there's some people who are activists and want to get back at Israel for what the Israeli militias, not really the Israeli state, but the militias did in 1948, which preceded the declaration of Israeli independence. So you've got them on one side, and then you've got the folks who don't really care and just want to be left alone, and there's a spectrum between them of people who don't like Israel for various reasons. But DeSantis here is clearly being dishonest, or maybe he's ignorant, I don't know, and thinks that there is some kind of unanimous consent here. But the fact is that that's not the case. It's that, but he believes for some reason that if you institute a kind of collective punishment on the Arab populations in the West Bank and Gaza, that somehow they will capitulate to Israel's demands, when I don't know what else a lot of the Arabs there individually, they are completely powerless to do anything. They can't even surrender to Israel. Individual people cannot just go up to an IDF soldier and say, okay, I give up. These are open-air prisons. I mean, you would think that the Jewish people, of all people, would understand what that's like, considering that the Jews were ghettoized in cities across Europe for centuries, and they also were subject to collective punishment. Jews were taxed as a group back in those days. They weren't taxed individually. And also, I believe if there was a Jew who committed a crime, the community itself was punished, not just the individual. And it's kind of sick when you think about it that now that's exactly what they do to the Arabs. And then you have U.S. politicians going along with it, and somehow pretending that collective punishment is one, effective, and two, moral. But I think this tends to be how Americans look at foreign policy in general. I've noticed this talking to a lot of Americans, is they'll say things like, oh yeah, but those Afghans, they were just picking for a fight, and and you have to ask them stuff like, which Afghans, which Iraqis, which Japanese people, who was picking for a fight? Because certainly there are plenty of individuals who don't have a choice in the matter and who do not want to fight, yet they are all punished just the same. I mean, I could certainly imagine that if, let's say, Mexico invaded the southern United States and they decided to start I don't know, bombing civilian areas, because they knew that there were militia groups in those civilian areas who were going to fight the Mexican army. But they were just killing everybody because you can't tell the difference between a terrorist and a civilian because they don't wear a uniform or anything. Do you not think that perhaps that would enrage quite a few Americans? That if there were parts of the U.S. Under military occupation, that would not enrage people? That would not make them, perhaps want to recognize the legitimacy of Mexico's control over those cities if Mexico just marched into El Paso? I think the most important thing then, if you're trying to talk to somebody who supports some kind of war and thinks that the recent U.S. wars, obviously there have been some just wars before. I do believe that there is such a thing as a just war. If you're trying to convince them that a particular war is unjust, just try and explain to them from the perspective an individual on the ground. Try and help them put themselves in the shoes of somebody who just happened to be born in a country that the U.S. is now at war with. Think about people who just are goat herders in the hills of Afghanistan. Did they have any choice where they were born? Did they have any choice as to what people around them are doing? Is it really their fault if they are, shot in the back herding a goat one day because somebody thinks that their staff looks like an RPG or something? I think that most people, when challenged, they will have some compassion for folks who are victims of foreign wars and things. And I think the same is true if you're trying to discuss Israel, so long as you're not speaking to people who are in favor of Israeli policies based on, religious principles, like, say, Christian Zionists. I have some Christian Zionist family. I would never try and convince them that what the Israelis are doing in the West Bank is bad or whatever, because they don't see that as individual acts of evil. They see that as as a greater act of God of putting the Jews back in the Middle East in the Holy Land, and that's a part of the end times prophecy. So it doesn't necessarily matter to them that there are individual acts of evil being committed because it's a part of God's greater plan or whatever. So they wouldn't try and obstruct that. So it's important when you're trying to convince somebody of these sorts of things to look at it from their perspective, and then help them look at these matters from somebody else's perspective. Empathy is the key word here. Empathy is at the root of every anti-war position. We create more anti-war people by helping them empathize with the victims of war, but we cannot ourselves convince anyone to become anti-war if we can't first empathize with the pro-war people. If you want to bring about peace, you have to be able to empathize with every side. I think that for anti-war people, it's pretty easy in general for them to empathize with a child who grows up in Gaza and ends up becoming some kind of a Hamas militant. We may disagree with that decision, but we at least understand how they came to it. But what's much more difficult is understanding someone who lives thousands of miles away and doesn't follow the situation very closely, being virulently pro-Israel on the matter and having a very strong opinion. That's much more difficult for most anti-war people to understand, and I think that's why they end up turning off and not being able to make converts from the pro-Israel side. I am not fully confident, but I'm fairly confident that if I sat down with Governor DeSantis and I had actual time to speak to him, not in front of any cameras, but in private as a human being, I could make him understand, at the very least, if not agree with, my position on the matter regarding Israel and the Palestinians. And I wouldn't do it by shouting at him and calling him evil and saying that he's a Zionist puppet or some other nonsense. All I would do is simply ask him to put himself in the shoes of a boy who grew up in Gaza, knowing nothing but violence, never being able to leave, never having any prospects really for a job, even let alone a career. And perhaps then he might understand how what Israel does to try and combat Palestinian terrorism in the end only creates more and more terrorists. They create generation after generation of terrorists. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the conflict between the Arabs and the Jews in the Holy Land started in a big way in 1948. It existed before that, but it started in a big way in 1948. All the people who fought in 1948 today, then are dead today, for the most part. But they're all certainly too old to fight each other. Who's fighting now? It's new generations of people. So you have to say to yourself, well, why do these new generations of people have a problem with the Israelis just like their parents and grandparents did? Why is that the case? Only once that problem is identified can people go about trying to solve it. Of course, my answer to that would be hopelessness. If you are born, as I've said multiple times now, in one of the Palestinian territories, you have no other options. There's nothing you can do. All you can do is lash out in anger and try to shake off the yoke of the circumstances that you were born with. So to sum things up, collective punishment is not an effective means of trying to sedate a population. When you punish an entire group for the actions of the few, that clearly feels like an injustice to the many. So what you end up doing then is just creating more and more people who hate you. You don't deter violent actions on the part of these people, you provoke them. Because these people will understand then that it's sort of a tragedy of the commons. If they don't act out in violence, somebody else will, and they'll all get punished anyway. So they may as well go down fighting and try to resist the Israelis. That's ultimately why this cycle of violence continues to this day. And it will continue until somebody tries to break that cycle of collective punishment, which just reinforces all the biases that the Palestinian population currently holds. If the Israelis ever wants to sedate the Palestinian population and make them live in peace, well, then they'll have to offer some kind of an opportunity for individual Palestinians to live in peace. I don't know how they would do that necessarily, but you have to do something that avoids collective punishment. Because as it currently stands, their option is to lay down and die, or to die fighting. If the Israelis want them to stop fighting, they need to give them some other option. So I think I've said enough on that matter. If you got anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, please do click the bell, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one, so I'll see you back here tomorrow.